Noelle, in your opinion, what are the key elements that make an engineering project successful, and how does risk management play a role in that?
Oftentimes, engineers like to look only at the technical aspect. That's the fun aspect. That's why they went to engineering school, became an engineer.
Right.
But it's important that when they work on projects that they understand that there are so many different elements. You have to not only manage that technical scope, but you have to manage the schedule, you have to manage the budget, and you have to manage the client expectations and the stakeholder expectations. And risk overlaps everywhere. You have technical risk, you have contractual risk, you have financial.
One of the most underrated skill sets for project managers in the AEC industry is the ability to plan for, identify, and mitigate risk. Well, in today's episode, I am thrilled to have with me Noelle Cochran. Noelle is a VP and Risk Management Director at AECOM, and she's going to take us through some things that you can do as a project manager in the architecture, engineering, and construction space to get better at risk management. And if you can do these things, you are going to really elevate yourself as a PM. Let's jump right in. All right, well, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the podcast for today. Noelle Cochran is Vice President and Risk Management Director at AECOM. Noelle, I want to welcome you to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Noelle, to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to your current role at AECOM?
Sure. I'm a civil engineer, and I spent my career working for consulting engineering companies. I started out as a geotechnical engineer and then leveraged those skills to move into a technical specialty for environmental site investigation and remediation, which is what I did for most of my career. Early on, I was very fortunate enough that I got some really good risk management and quality management training from the companies that I worked for. I found that was very interesting, so I decided to expand my knowledge by doing a lot of outside reading, getting some additional risk management quality education. That led me to becoming the quality program lead at a small company that I worked for and leading their training program and putting on some training related to risk management as well as quality. And along the way, I always incorporated the risk management and quality into the project work I did. And I found that was very beneficial, really helped to enhance the work that I was doing. And it allowed me to do more complex engineering and to do it well and to have good deliverables. I also, early on, got involved in some litigation support for some clients. I had been doing some engineering work for them, and they had some legal issues, and they needed to have an engineer help them. So they pulled me in, and I started working with their attorneys to help them write some of their technical papers, to help them do some of their technical responses. And I learned a lot by doing so. It was fascinating. And my company got a little bit more involved in some litigation support. I ended up changing employers, moving on to some other opportunities, still incorporating the risk management, quality, and taking some of what I learned from that litigation support into my project management, people management, operations management work. A handful of years ago, I got an opportunity to take on a risk management position at AECOM, and I was very fortunate to be recommended and selected for that position.
That's great. And it's interesting hearing you describe your background a little bit, because I feel like there are always parts in your career where you really remember, that were a big boost to your learning and development. It sounds like that litigation support experience for you was very beneficial in your overall development.
It was very beneficial. I worked with attorneys who were the client's attorneys, and they taught me a lot. I learned a lot about different things, aspects from the legal perspective. And as we worked together, there were different things that they would ask me to help guide them from the technical aspects. And I worked with some of them for quite some time. And as we developed that relationship, it was really helpful to me. I learned so much from them that I was able then to take to my other engineering projects to make me a better engineer and project manager.
That's great. So, Noelle, in your opinion, what are the key elements that make an engineering project successful, and how does risk management play a role in that?
Oftentimes, engineers like to look only at the technical aspect. That's the fun aspect. That's why they went to engineering school, became an engineer.
Right.
But it's important that when they work on projects that they understand that there's so many different elements. You have to not only manage that technical scope, but you have to manage the schedule. You have to manage the budget, and you have to manage the client expectations and the stakeholder expectations. And risk overlaps everywhere. You have technical risk, you have contractual risk, you have financial risk, safety risk, even reputational risk. And so it's important that a project manager is aware of all of those things, all of those elements of what makes a project successful, including the risk management, and they incorporate that in every step of the way, from their initial planning, through their proposal writing, through their execution of the project, and even project closeout.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we do a lot of project management training and learning and development with firms across the country. And when we design these curriculum, it's always seems like risk gets left out a lot, from the company standpoint. They're focused on scope, schedule, budget, like you suggest, and
Right.
the technical topics that go into it. And a lot of times we'll have to say to them, well, what about risk? And sometimes they'll say, oh, well, that's like a more advanced topic. Oh, yeah, but I think it's good to educate project managers and engineers on risk as early on in their career as possible, just to start them to get thinking in that direction. Because like you said, we can be kind of sometimes have tunnel vision on the technical side of things, scope, schedule, budget, which is what everybody wants to say when they hear project management. So I do think that's important. But Noelle, what are some of the common pitfalls in engineering risk management that engineers or other technical professionals might overlook, and how can they kind of be more wary of those things?
One of the most common is the contract. Engineers feel that they're not lawyers. They didn't go to law school. So, they'll just let the lawyer handle the contract. And they don't read the contract, and they don't understand how the contract relates to their project. But it's really the rule book for executing their project. And it's important that they understand the contract requirements. It might be related to how they manage change orders. It might have guidance on how they address safety, how they invoice and get payment, and how they handle any kind of an issue that arises on the project. So it's important that they understand the contract. Oftentimes, they don't understand how the financial aspect of the project or even the schedule and delays can relate to those contract requirements. And it's important that they understand all of that and that they're aware of the risk related to contract and financial and all those other risk elements as they move into that project management and execution.
Yeah, that's a great point, because one thing that we try to preach is that you got to have a good project management plan or planning process ahead of your project. And what part of that plan should be reviewing the contract as a PM and understanding all the ramifications. For example, if there is a change order on a project, maybe the contract stipulates that you need to give the client, 14 or 21 days to review it and approve it. And that can really affect your schedule in a tight project. And so understanding your responsibilities and some of the timelines and things that can be laid out in the contract without that understanding definitely presents a risk. So I really like that. And that's why, to me, you need a good project management plan, which forces you to read through the contract.
Yes, definitely. And you want to not only read through it, but you want to understand it, and you want to share elements of that contract with the project team so that they also understand how it affects their work. And as they implement the project and they have deliverables or they have some things that they need to fulfill under that contract, that they do the right thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a big part of it. We always say in our training that your scope is kind of like a fence around your project. Everything within the fence is your responsibility. Everything outside of it is not. And if you're not communicating where the fence is to your team,
right,
they may end up outside of it, right? Which is problematic. So, Noelle, how does strategic client selection help in reducing corporate risk?
It's very important. I know that engineers want to work for every client potentially. And it's important that they evaluate their clients. There are some clients that they should just not work for. There are clients who have unreasonable expectations. They want to have great engineering products, but they want to have an unreasonable schedule, or they want to have a bargain price, and that doesn't make sense. In some cases, they just have expectations that really cannot be met. In some cases, they might be unreasonable with their contract. They might want to push way too much risk onto the engineers, and they're not fair from the get-go with their contract, and they're not open to negotiation. If they're not open to negotiation on the contract, how are they going to behave if an issue arises on the project? Are they going to be willing to work it out, or are they going to run to a lawyer and bring a claim? So it's important to assess how a client is going to interact with the team, and are they going to be favorable and fair as the project is executed and problems arise. It's also important to evaluate clients from a financial perspective. You don't want to have a client that can't pay for the engineering services. So it looks really great initially. Everybody's happy at the beginning. The engineers are off and running, and they send an invoice in, and they don't get payment. But the client has expectations. They continue work, but the client has a financial problem. He cannot pay. Nobody wants to work for free because a client can't pay. So it's important to assess those clients kind of from the work perspective, the fairness perspective, as well as the financial perspective, and address that client risk early on before you submit a proposal and before you sign that contract.
Yeah, this is really important. And I agree with Noelle. A lot of engineering companies or, AEC firms, they want to just work with everyone. Right? Let's get the proposal, do the proposal, work on it, get it in. We got to work on it. And you can get burned pretty bad if you take on the wrong client on one of our projects. It can really, go underwater with it. And in fact, one of the things that we've done at EMI, and I know we don't necessarily do engineering, we more work with engineering firms, but we kind of put a client rating system in place where you can evaluate a client based on several different factors, like how quickly do they pay? What are the payment terms? How easy are they to work with? What's the size of the potential project, right? So I think having a process where you rate the client, or you at least look at the client, as Noelle suggested, and think about some of their financial health and things of that nature, is very important. And I agree, even the terms, like maybe they're one of these companies that their payment terms are way out as opposed to everybody else. And you're going to have to be sitting there waiting for money longer than everybody else. And maybe that's just not the right fit for you.
Yes, that's important. Want to be able to get payment on time, keep that cash flow up, because engineers have to pay their employees. And it's important that they do get prompt payment.
Absolutely. So we talked earlier, Noelle, about how the contract is a huge area for potential risks. So what are some red flags to look for during proposal review and contract negotiation that could indicate potential risks?
One thing to look for in the contract is to look for reasonable terms. Again, is the client willing to keep some of the risk? Are they pushing too much risk unfairly onto the engineer? Also, are they willing to negotiate? Are they willing to listen to any requests for some changes to those contract terms? If they're willing to listen and negotiate, that's a good sign. If they say, no, we don't want to talk about it, take it as it is, that could be a problem sign, and that could be a red flag. If they're not willing to negotiate, they're not willing to listen and communicate at the very initial contract negotiation stage. Sometimes there are some red flags in the request for proposal. So the contract might be one element, but it typically comes out with the request for proposal. And in the request for proposal, there could be obvious red flags. In some cases, it could be how the client states the scope of work. They could be asking for way too much. They could be asking for some kind of a performance level that is above the standard of care. And the standard of care is what other engineers would do on the same project at the same time under the same circumstances. So if that request for proposal indicates we want to have the highest level of something or the best product or some of these elements that elevate the standard of care, that could be a red flag. If they want to have certain requirements and they have a whole lot of things they want from the engineer, but they have an unreasonable schedule, or they have a not to exceed budget amount that is unreasonable, again, those can be red flags. There's not a balance between scope, schedule, and budget. And if you see that there is a misbalance there, that's a problem. That's a red flag as well. So look for those kinds of things. And then in the proposal, when a senior person at a company is reviewing the proposal, if they see that there is a vague scope offering, or they see that there are some assumptions that are missing, that could be a red flag that the team needs some more risk management training. And that would be something to handle internally to correct that proposal before it's submitted to the client. But it could be a red flag of some internal risk management needs as well. So the contract can have some red flags. Their request for proposal can have red flags, and then the proposal itself can have red flags.
Wow, that's a lot of good information there. And really what I'm kind of hearing in this entire conversation with Noelle is you're looking for red flags as a project manager, right? When it comes to risk, whether
Yes.
that's something that your client says or the potential client says, whether there's something in a contract, whether it's a terminology, whether it's something you read about from a past project that they got into trouble with, right? You
Yes.
constantly have to keep your eye out for something that could tell you about a potential risk in a relationship with that client or on that project or any of the stakeholders potentially in that project. And also what I think is really important around risk is it's a very high leverage skill set because like Noelle just said, if you identify something in one of your proposals that's could present risk or open you up to risk and you fix it for all future projects, you just potentially saved yourself across the organization on how many projects going forward, especially when you're talking about a company the size of AECOM, right? So I like risk identification and risk management and risk planning because if you can get a good risk process down, checklist process that you can follow on every project, it should really have an impact across your organization.
And it can be as simple as what we do when we get ready to drive somewhere. We pull out our cell phone and we look at what route should we take. Are there routes that maybe have some construction or road closures, things like that? So we pick the best route. And then we plan how long is it going to take for us to get there. Maybe we look at a picture of our destination. What is it going to look like when we get there? Is there going to be a place for us to park? And as we get ready to start our journey, we check that we have appropriate fuel in the tank, that we have air in our tires, our mirrors are set right, and we put our seatbelt on. It's the same kind of thing with a project. We need to do those same kinds of things. What route are we going to take? How are we going to get to there? And what is that end going to look like for us? And are there some things that we should anticipate along the way? Are there going to be some things that will cause us to change our route? Or maybe will affect our schedule and take us longer to get to where we want to end up with. Same kind of thing. We do it every day when we drive somewhere. We don't necessarily think about it. We need to do the same for projects.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's like a little bit of planning goes a very long way when it comes to risk prevention. So I have to ask you this question. We do a lot of project management training and we get resistance sometimes from these technical professionals because all they want to do is work on the deliverables of their project and be utilized and go at 100 miles an hour. So how do you guide your teams to kind of prioritize and address safety risks without compromising performance or deadlines?
Encourage them to look at safety very early on as they're developing the proposal because some of the safety mitigations have financial costs to them. Sometimes you have to get additional equipment. Sometimes you might have to have a safety person on the project. There are a lot of considerations that affect both your staffing and affect your costs. And it's important to look at that early on. Again, you're doing that early planning on your project and you're incorporating it from the very beginning before you even start the project. By doing that and working ahead, you're going to help mitigate from having safety problems arise during execution, which means you're not going to have some lost time because of a safety issue. You're not going to have a problem where a key person on the project is perhaps injured and out, and it's really going to help you from your schedule aspect. It's going to help you from your cost aspect and overall from your execution. So it's going to help you all across the project if you plan for safety from the very beginning.
Yeah, really important to think about safety very early on. And I know a lot of the firms we work with really have that safety first mentality, and that is very important. So, kind of a little bit along the same lines, but more related to back to risk management. How can consulting teams, engineering teams enhance their project delivery, but also keep that risk management kind of at the forefront of their operations in their project delivery?
Plan ahead, think about it at the beginning, and continue to address risk as they execute the project. So continue to go back to the risks they identified at the beginning of the project, because some risks will go away and some risks will arise. Certainly you want to evaluate that with respect to your operations, because those risks could affect your staffing and they can affect your financial performance as well. Those are both very important for operations. So continue to address risk issues as the project is executed. Don't write a plan and put it on the shelf. Instead, keep going back, keep looking at it, keep refreshing it. Look at what will those costs be related to that risk. Are those things going away? Now we could shift some of those costs elsewhere and evaluate that on a constant basis with respect to the operations aspects.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and I just want to spend a minute on it here because I feel like this happens with different aspects of project management where, just like you just described with risk, you may focus on it at the beginning of the project because you're excited to start the project, you're checking on risk, you do your kickoff meeting, you're doing a lot of communication with your stakeholders, right? Then you get into your project and it starts going, and a lot of that stuff goes by the wayside. I know that happens a lot with project communication where you've got this great kickoff meeting, all the stakeholders are there, you're going through the project plan, you're educating everybody, and then you get working and you stop the updates and you're not letting people know what's going on. And I think the same thing can happen with risk and other aspects of project management. So I think a general rule of thumb for project managers that's really important is you have to be consistent through every phase of the project in terms of your risk management, your communication efforts, your planning, your stakeholder interaction, all of your project management activities should be consistent throughout the project so you don't have that drop off. And that's where, in my opinion, errors, mistakes, the schedule can get off because you're so in the details as a PM where you really need to be more of the owner of the project and kind of overseeing these different aspects of it. So I would really try to keep that high level view on every aspect of project management so that your teams can focus on the delivery side of it and really get into the details.
And it is helpful to have the team members also watch out for risk as they do their work, because sometimes the risk is going to be identified by the person performing field work or the person doing the calculations or the person who is interacting with the client. It's important that everybody on the team looks out for risk. It's not just the project manager's responsibility, it's the team's. And that helps everyone to keep their eye on risk as they execute.
Yeah, and that goes a long way with good risk management training and education within the organization. And I think that starts with the PM. If you train your PMs up on risk management and they can build that culture with their team, it's only going to help them going forward. And then hopefully when their teams become PM, they have a risk mindset, which I think is not necessarily common in our industry, unfortunately, like we've talked about a little bit. So the other question that I get sometimes, Noelle, is a lot of engineers I talk to are eager to get into roles with greater responsibility, especially where they get to be involved in the financial and contractual aspects of their projects. How can they transition into some of those activities in their career?
They should ask if they can get some training inside of their organization. So go to a supervisor, ask how their organization handles risk, and find out what their processes are. That's important. They also should do some outside education. Fortunately, there is a lot of information that they can find by going out onto the internet, looking at some problem projects. There's a lot of information about engineering problem projects, and they can read about the cause of that issue, and they can learn from that. If they're in engineering organizations, whether that might be something like the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Society of Professional Engineers, or other engineering organizations, if they read the magazines or the journals, they'll also find out what made a project successful, what made a project not successful. So do some outside education. Take some courses on contracts. Learn about contract terms and conditions. Learn about general management of projects from the financial aspect as well. And they need to enhance their education. That will help them a lot. And they can talk to other project managers and say, well, what have you experienced on your projects? When did you have a problem on your project? What did you do about it and how did it get resolved? Talk to people, seek some mentoring, seek some outside education, and start to build on that themselves. And that will help them not only to be a better project manager and engineer, but will help them to move into some different roles in their career.
That's great. And I really like that answer, because basically what I take away from that is you gotta invest in yourself, right? Go out there and educate yourself. There's plenty of information out there. There's no excuses that you can't find information on contracts and engineering or financial concepts. Sure, there's going to be some specific things to your company, of course, but there's certainly going to be some education and information available out there. And if you want to go further in your career, if you want to be a great project manager, you're going to have to continue to upskill. And in some firms and organizations, they may have the proper training and education to do that. Sometimes that takes longer to get to you, and you need to try to get something on your own. So I really like the idea of, if you want to get more involved in finance and contracts, learn about it and have a conversation with your supervisor. Hey, I've been learning a lot and studying contracts. Can I get more involved in it? Typically, if you do that, they're going to say, yeah, we can use help.
Typically they will, and they'll be very glad that the person asked, because they often don't get asked about risk. So they'll be glad to have that conversation and to be able to share their knowledge.
Yeah, I know for me, when I was working for a consulting firm and I was doing performance reviews, if someone says this past year I went to 2 courses on my own on contracts, that tells you a lot about that person too, in terms of their determination, their persistence, and their willingness to grow themselves in their career. So I think that it's very valuable. All right, so Noelle, one last piece of advice that you could share with our audience looking to advance in their careers and become effective project management leaders.
So one thing is for them to be open to accepting that there's risk on every project. It's important that they know that, yes, risk is out there. It's on projects. It's on the kinds of projects that they do. It's on the kinds of projects that their organization does. And to be open to looking for it, to be open to working with others to address it. So that's really a very important part, is think about it. Be open to conversations. Work with others to address it. It's not something they have to do on their own. There's a team usually behind them, and they need to work with that team to identify and address risks. And that's really important, not only for their project management, but for their leadership as well.
Yeah, I think that's really a big takeaway, is that as you grow as a project manager and you get involved in some of the things that Noelle has talked about today, risk, contracts, those types of conversations, those types of topics are going to really force you to build your confidence and become a better leader, because they're tricky issues to talk about with people. And to me, from my experience, when I get into conversations like that, it really pushes me a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And I start to grow not just as a project manager, but as a leader, because those are the types of things that you're going to have to get involved with as you grow in this industry. The things that people don't always want to get involved with.
Yes.
So. So, Noelle, I have one more question for you today. In your experience, what would you say is one of the biggest pitfalls that you've identified for project managers in the industry, and how can they overcome it or avoid this pitfall?
With respect to risk management, I think one of the biggest pitfalls that I've observed is that sometimes project managers are naive about risk and risk management. Sometimes they're complacent about risk and risk management. And sometimes, unfortunately, they're a little defiant about risk and risk management. And those attitudes can be a pitfall. It's important that the risk managers start to recognize, if they don't understand risk management because they're naive, that they get some additional education related to risk management. Sometimes they're complacent. They say, well, I've done this kind of work before. Nothing's ever happened. And no, nothing will ever will. I've worked with this client for years. We have a great relationship. It will never go sour. Or, gosh, we've done these things before. We've worked with these subcontractors. And gosh, nothing will ever happen. And I wish I could say that was true. That wouldn't happen. Complacency can be a big problem and a pitfall. If they don't recognize that they're complacent, they can overlook significant risks that can affect the relationship, their financial performance, and lead to technical problems. And then lastly, those that say, I want to win this project. I'm not going to consider risks. I'm not going to price for it. I'm going to just move ahead. and they don't consider it and something happens. So a lot of times it's the attitude about risk management that is a problem. We want PMs to understand risk. We want them to appropriately address it. We want them to have the right attitude going in because it can make a significant difference on their execution, their delivery, and their overall project success.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that a lot of times because we don't understand something fully, we tend to avoid it and we shy away from it. And I think that, to your point, risk is certainly not something that we could just say, we don't get it, so we're going to, don't think about it or, not consider it on our project. So if you're not educated on risk, if you haven't done a lot of risk planning or risk management, kind of like Noelle said earlier, get training on it, seek training on it, whether it's on your own or within your organization, so that you can spend attention on it. And if you can't for that project, find someone who can. Reach out to another expert in your organization and get that help, because the last thing you want to do is just, brush off risk because you don't know about it or don't know how to plan for it properly. So that's some great advice there.
Absolutely. And there are lots of people usually in a different company or organization that are willing to help a project manager with their risk management, and they should reach out.
Yeah. And again, you're not going to get help unless you ask for it. And I know sometimes younger engineering professionals are a little bit afraid to ask for help because they see it as a sign of weakness, but it's really not. You should be a sponge throughout your entire career. You should always be soaking in information and learning. And I know for me, if someone that's on my team asks me to learn about something, like I said earlier, I see it as a sign of their interest to learn and grow. And I think that that's actually a valuable attribute. So it's something you should definitely do. So once again, Noelle Cochran, licensed professional engineer, vice president and risk management director at AECOM. We really appreciate some time from you today here on the podcast.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Noelle. It was awesome to have someone with her experience in risk management spend some time with us. And, I think just the idea of getting more familiar with contracts and the risk process and planning upfront in your projects is really going to help you to be a better PM. We see this so much at EMI. PMs just discount risk and risk management, but it's such an important skill. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to our channel here. We do put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I hope to see you next week.